The fabled lost race. The people of the deep. If you've ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand on end as you wander deeper into the vast chambers of one of their elaborate cities, or felt your heartbeat quicken at the hiss of a steam piston or distant clank of unknown origins, that means that you, my friend, probably need to get a life. But since we both know lives are overrated and that's never gonna happen, well met! And welcome back to Lifting Lore, a series where we take an in-depth look at our favorite video game characters and see just what lessons we can learn from them and apply not only to our fitness quest, but to our lives in general. And the question of the day is, what kind of extraordinary event would have been required to completely wipe an entire race off the face of the planet forever? What did the Dwemer do to incur such an ill fate? And most importantly, how do they sit on these toilets without getting their bottoms wet? But in order to wrap our heads around the complexities of these topics, we first need to go back to the origins of this shrewd and reclusive folk to set the scene for the rise of the most intellectually profound and technologically advanced breed of elves to ever grace the face of Nerd. I'm Rance, this is Muscle and Magicka, and you, my friend, just accepted a quest. Down. As the celebrated heroes of every Elder Scrolls chapter, we often take for granted the privilege of casually scrolling through a character creation menu, conveniently picking from a well-defined number of elf races based on our favorite perks, playstyle, or aesthetic preference, with little regard for the fact that there was a time, well before the Empires of Man, when there was no such thing as distinction between races of elves, because they were all one and the same, holding the same beliefs, worshipping the same ancestors, eating the same breakfast cereal. That is, until the Sundering of Aldmeris, a primeval event which witnessed the fracturing of Aldmeri culture along both social and racial lines. It's hard to say for certain exactly why the Dwemer or any of the other intransigent groups originally split off from Somerset, but judging based off of the vastly differing cultures we observe in the various Mara societies that exist today, it's a safe bet that most of these splits were probably due to ideological, philosophical, and religious differences. Unfortunately for the Dwemer, their preference for facial hair and living deep beneath the earth didn't do anything to help their mischaracterization as dwarves, which was supposedly started by the early giants that are said to have inhabited Morrowind, as a term of endearment for their little Dwemer friends, who were, in fact, no more little than your average elf or man. The term Dwemer, which translates to deep folk, couldn't be a more accurate descriptor for these deep-diving elves, considering their fondness for subterranean lifestyle, as well as an unsurpassed depth of thought. The Dwemer were a stoic lot, to say the least, primarily interested in the endeavors of science, mathematics, and engineering. They valued logic, reason, and the scientific method as paramount, and their hearts and minds were home to a remarkably incredulous nature, a sort of cardinal disbelief, which they applied liberally not only to the world around them, but also to their very own faculties. This extreme skepticism was woven into the very fiber of their being, and as fate would have it, may have been the unique thread that, when followed to its conclusion, ultimately caused the unraveling of the Dwemer people and their disintegration from reality as they knew it. But a fondness for theorems and a penchant for introversion weren't the only things driving the wedge between this particular contingent of bearded elves and their Aldmeri brethren. As a rule, most elves hold a very high degree of veneration for the gods, typically worshipping either their ancestors or the Aedra, or in some cases even the Daedra. The Dwemer took a more agnostic point of view, which isn't necessarily to say that they didn't believe that gods exist. Let's just say they had several questions regarding the amount of power and authority most mortals indiscriminately ascribe to the gods, which shouldn't be surprising, coming from a race that had their doubts about the validity of reality itself. And so it was that sometime in the mid to late Merethic era, the early Dwemer unfurled their beards to the wind and forged a new path, eventually coming to settle in what is now known as modern-day Morrowind, although 4 eras and roughly as many names ago was simply called Dwemereth, later expanding westward into Skyrim, High Rock, and even as far as Hammerfell. It's been posited that what records we have of the Dwemer have been marked chiefly by their conflicts with other races and amongst themselves, and as such, it's often assumed that they must have been a very combative and hostile race. However, I think history tells a slightly more nuanced story than that. Toward the end of the Merethic era, the Daedra-worshipping Chimer, who would later become the modern-day Dunmer, arrived in an already inhabited Dwemerith, having just moved out of Somerset themselves and looking for a land to call their own where they could worship Daedra to their heart's content and go to bed when they damn well pleased. And while initial relations between the two races were by no means friendly, there was at least a coexistence of sorts, by which I mean neither race technically declared all-out war. Or at least not in writing. But this uneasy agreement eventually blossomed into a full-on alliance when the Nords invaded and occupied Dwemerith, folding it into their first Nordic empire. What they failed to realize is that they were providing just the common enemy needed to unite these two groups of Aldmeri offshoots. And thus was born the First Council, and it's said that it was in that very moment that the Nords knew they fucked up. Now, one might argue that this was more an alliance of necessity than camaraderie, and one would be right. But the fact remains that after the First Council succeeded in driving the Nords out, they ceremonially renamed the land Risdane in honor of their cohabitation, and the Dwemer and Chimer enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace between their two peoples. And it's even said that over time, their respective leaders, Dumak Dwarf King and Indoril Nerevar, became not just diplomatic allies, but fast friends. But the Chimer wasn't the only race to have dealings with the Deep Ones prior to their unceremonious displacement from Nurd. Westward, Skyrim's original inhabitants, the Snow Elves, were being driven out of their home and slaughtered wholesale by the Nordic champion Ysgramor and his 500 companions. They were just on the brink of total destruction when the Dwemer opened their great doors, sending forth their fearless mechanical armies onto the battlefield and providing refuge and relief for their Aldmeri cousins. Now, of course, we have the benefit of knowing what the Falmer became as a direct result of this negotiation, and it would be disingenuous of me to try to paint this as some kind of picture of total altruism on the part of the Dwemer. But it is worth mentioning that this was just that, a negotiation. And if Knight Paladin Gelibor is to be believed, and who wouldn't believe a face like this, a little bit of casual blinding and toxic fungus was part of the agreement from day one. And while this still may strike you as the ill-conceived machinations of a cruel and sinister race, there is evidence to suggest that there may have been a much deeper reasoning behind the Dwemer's treatment of the Falmer, a little more complex than simple savagery for the sake of it, and perhaps even bordering on the edge of compassion. But we'll pick that thread back up shortly. Probably the most visually apparent characteristic that really distinguished the Dwemer from their elven counterparts was their mechanical and industrial prowess, which allowed them to develop technologies which were extraordinarily advanced for their time, the likes of which have really never been seen since. From the unparalleled craftsmanship of their weapons and armor, to the wonders and innovation of their steam-powered machinery, the Dwemer commanded a proclivity for creative design that rivaled that of the gods themselves. But one of the greatest and most secretive of their methods was their mastery of a bygone form of magic known as tonal architecture, which their artisans used to execute the remarkable feats of geological engineering that produced their enormous and ornate subsurface dwellings. And this was accomplished by essentially manipulating the underlying musical notes that comprise reality. Now, it's been theorized that this ancient technique is responsible for the pristine conditions their towering underground cities remain in to this day, nearly untouched by the ravages of time. Now, it may be common sentiment among the denizens of Tamriel that it was the dwarves' great hubris that led to their downfall, but these enlightened Mer possessed a certain ingenuity, a resourcefulness that was unrivaled by their peers. And frankly, it would be an unjustifiable sin of omission not to acknowledge the scope and grandeur of their prolific achievements, especially in a world where the very existence of magic had all but crippled technological advancement. Unfortunately, this particular brand of bohemian brilliance was a double-edged sword, and through the admixture of their insatiable curiosity, their preference for seclusion, and their affinity for plumbing the great depths, there formed something of a perfect storm, which inevitably led them to uncover something dark and insidious, lying dormant deep in the heart of Red Mountain. The heart of Lorkhan, vestige of a time long forgotten. Ripped from the god's chest as divine retribution for his unspeakable trespasses during the creation of Mundus, it had been buried deep in the sea before the beginning of linear time. Nerevar was devastated to learn that not only had the Dwemer uncovered this powerful Aedric artifact, But at that very moment, Dumac's chief tonal architect, High Priest Kagranak, was actually developing a set of tools intended to tap the heart and use it to power a gargantuan brass golem of Dwemeri making. For all intents and purposes, the Dwemer were attempting to construct a new god out of the old parts of a dead one. The mere idea of this grotesque monstrosity was intensely loathsome to the Chimer, but more than that, it was exceptionally dangerous, not just to the Dwemer below the surface, or to the Chimer above, but to the whole of Tamriel. And so Nerevar confronted his once friend Dumac. It was hard to tell from his blank expression whether the Dwarven King was feigning ignorance, or whether he was genuinely unaware of what his subordinate was planning. Regardless, one thing was sure. It would be impossible to allow the Dwemer to continue to desecrate the gods in this manner, and so cavalierly tinker with forces more dangerous than their godless minds could comprehend. As much as it pained him, Nerevar knew the Chimer and their old allies must go to war. But the Dwemer found themselves in the midst of not one, but two battles, defending their gates against their Chimeri attackers at Red Mountain, whilst simultaneously working to contain an uprising from within, as the vengeful Falmer had staged a full-scale revolt in Skyrim, deep beneath the surface in the caverns of Blackreach. Now, if there was one thing the Dwemer had going for them, aside from their massive technological advantage, it was the fabled Dwemeri ability known as the Calling, which allowed them to communicate with one another telepathically over long distances. However, because of this link, it's also safe to say that the Deep Elves as a whole were under a tremendous amount of strain, which only increased when their great leader, Dumac Dwarf King, finally fell at the hands of Nerevar himself. And it was in that sudden moment of haste that Magecrafter Kagranak collected his enchanted tools, the hammer, Sunder, the tuning fork Keening, and the gauntlet Wraithguard, and approached the heart. And whether what happened next was according to some unspoken plan, or a terrible mistake born of grave miscalculation, every last Dwemer on the face of Nerd collectively vanished, leaving behind no trace except for their empty halls and sleepless machinery, which were now no more than faint echoes of the preeminent race that once established them. The nature of what occurred in that one moment has been the topic of centuries of contemplation and debate by some of the greatest scholars of their time and some of the nerdiest lorebeards of ours. It's been suggested that maybe the Dwemer accidentally transported themselves into a realm of oblivion, which isn't entirely implausible considering that the one and only known living Dwemer, Yagran Bagarn, is in fact only here today because he happened to be traveling through Oblivion when the rest of his race disappeared. However, it's also that very fact that casts this theory into question, as if the entire Dwemer race had just popped into Oblivion while Bagarn was still there, I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine that the telepathic link that they shared should have at the very least alerted him to their presence. Others have guessed that the Dwemer's abrupt withdrawal from this world may have been the doing of the Daedric prince Azura, who supposedly hated the dwarves for their irreverence. In fact, one source even goes so far as to claim that it wasn't even Kagranak striking the heart that was the catalyst for their disappearance, but rather Azura, who guided Nerevar to use Kagranak's tools on the heart, separating its power from the Dwemer, and thus removing from them the immortality they'd stolen from it. Now granted, the idea of Azura disliking the Dwemer certainly makes some sense given their cynical and agnostic nature, especially if we are to believe the story of Azura in the Box, in which an audacious Dwemer succeeds in fooling the Daedric prince with what amounted to essentially a party trick, calling into question the extent of the Daedra's power and knowledge. But even so, the premise that Azura had both the inclination and the power to remove an entire race of beings off the face of Nirn doesn't strike me as any more likely than the idea that she was able to hastily teach Nerevar, in the heat of battle mind you, how to use an immensely complicated set of metaphysical tools intended for the shaping of mythopoeic forces. But there is one hypothesis, one piecing together of all the variables that offers a strikingly cogent and persuasive explanation for what really took place inside Red Mountain all those centuries ago. Thanks to the work of Dunmeri sorcerer Baladas Demnavani, it's come to light that the Dwemer had conducted heavy research into an obscure process known as subgradiency, and specifically on the death of the Earthbones. Now, in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about the origin of the Aurbis and how the process of subgradiency, or in other words, the creation of lower dimensions, was integral, from Anu and Padme all the way down to the very first mundane race, the ancient progenitors of all mortal life on Nern. Now, in the last step of the creation of Mundus, there were some original spirits who chose to give up their immortality and divinity and lay themselves down willingly. And these were called the Earthbones because in sacrificing themselves, they became the governing laws and principles of the mortal realm, as well as the actual physical mass of the planet, allowing for its structure and form, both abstract and physical, so that others might be able to survive in it in corporeal form. And it was precisely this process of the sacred willing itself into the profane that the Dwemer rapidly dissected until, in due course, they discovered systematic regression techniques that would allow them to perform the reverse, that is, to create the sacred from the depths of the profane. The one common through line amongst all the races of Mer on Tamriel is the premier belief that they were and are descendant of the gods, and as such, they possess an innate desire to return to that previous state of existence. Where the Dwemer seem to have differed from their brethren was in their methodology. So rather than trying to work their way back up the creational chain, they denied this reality entirely, opting instead to manufacture their own reality, their own new medium, as it were, which they would use to catapult themselves not backward, but forward into a new dream, a new universe unto themselves. Believe it or not, some of the strongest evidence to support this theory is right there in plain sight, just waiting to be found every time you enter a Dwemer ruin. Eternally vigilant, ceaselessly executing the directives of the masters even centuries after their disappearance. That's right, animunculi. Thanks to the research notes of Sula Trebasius, we know that contrary to popular belief, the soul gems built into the Dwemer constructs don't seem to actually power them. That's done by steam power, and in the cases of some of the larger constructs, dynamo cores. But the soul gem itself seems instead to act as a sort of brain, or programming center for the unit, which works by receiving and inputting various tones. So the tones vibrate the metal, and the soul gem then interprets that vibration, translates it into various commands, and then outputs those commands to the unit. The question is, who are the souls that are filling the soul gems? And that's where it gets interesting. A close look reveals that the book Antecedents of Dwemer Law uses the plural form animunculi even when specifically referring to a single unit. Now, animunculi is a pluralized version of the word animunculus, which means little soul. So in effect, what we have is each individual automaton presented as many little souls. Now we know that a common byproduct of the act of creation is the fracturing of the souls used to create the subgradient. It's the same thing that happened to the Aedra when Mundus was formed. But this same soul fragmentation can also result from a failed attempt at anti-creation, which, as it happens, is exactly what the Dwemer were experimenting with. They were trying to anneal souls back together into a state of lesser subgradients. But imagine trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle of an image that exists in a higher dimension that your brain can't even comprehend. Naturally, their creations were unstable and would inevitably shatter into fragmented echoes of the original souls. In other words, their failure to reverse the process of subgradients led the Dwemer to the realization of a new avenue. Instead of trying to go up, they could go down into a never-before-seen subgradient. What if every spider, sphere, and centurion you'd ever encountered in a Dwemer ruin was actually a tiny universe, powered by the fractured remnants of Dwemeri souls that were split and now orbit the original site of their anti-creation, the soul gem of a Dwemer construct? But what if that were just the precursor? What if the Dwemer had worked out a way to do the same thing, but on a massive scale, involving every last member of their race and a titanic brass golem? In the same way that Audiel, Lorcan, and the Et Ada were fractured and bound to Mundus in the creation of the mortal plane, the Dwemer would use Lorcan's heart to fracture themselves, binding them to the Numidium and creating a brand new subgradient, a newborn universe of which they would be the gods. And in fact, the pursuit of this goal may shed some interesting light onto their relationship with the snow elves, which seems like some kind of grim and gruesome experiment. There are those who have theorized that blinding the Falmer and thrusting them into some of the deepest, darkest holes imaginable may have actually been an intended form of sensory deprivation, which is believed to be a crucial factor in the process of Amaranth. Regardless, the question remains, was the Dwemer's disappearance actually a part of the plan? Or was it a flubbed attempt, based on well-reasoned but incomplete mathematics? Was it Kagranak, or Nerevar, or Azura, or the Tribunal that was the prime mover? Or was it all four, due to the effects of a localized dragon break, which consequently sent the Dwemer into some future timeline? What's the best explanation, taking all sources into account? What did the writers intend for the answer to be? Let me ask you an even more important question. Would you really want to know? Of all the impressive technologies and sagacious philosophies the Dwemer employed, arguably the most profound impact they had on Tamrielic society and on us was their disappearance. And having the express solution to that disappearance would totally deprive us of the ability to speculate. It would destroy the air of mystique and gravitas surrounding this cryptic civilization, and would rob us once and for all of one of the greatest sources of awe and mystery these games have to offer. The Dwemer are so interesting precisely because we don't know where they are, because of the clues they left behind and the compulsion to try to solve a multifaceted metaphysical riddle that spans continents, eras, and games. And while they may not have left behind any definitive answers, what the Dwemer did leave behind is even better. They left us with the tools to follow in their footsteps, and because of their pioneering efforts, we now have a fundamental framework for becoming more than what we are. 1. Embrace an evidence-based perspective. The greatest tools that mankind has been given to intuit the secrets of the universe are not magical artifacts. They are his senses. But the Dwemer understood that these senses can be flawed and highly inaccurate due to our mortal propensity for emotion and bias. And their safeguard for this was a skepticism which prompted them to question everything, including the nature of reality itself. They saw both phenomena, which is our subjective perception of the things around us, and noumena, which is the actual nature of the things themselves, to be equal illusions, with the second one just being a little more clever. This is why they retreated into science, seeking a much more dependable and reproducible method for learning that which is knowable. 2. Surround yourself with a support group. Because of the Great Calling, the Dwemer were bound together intrinsically and inseparably, and this bond held true for better or for worse. No matter what happened, the Dwemer were in it together, as a whole. Most of us, when trying to make a change or pursue a goal, like to play the hero and shoulder the entirety of the burden ourselves, on the one hand overestimating our own strength, and on the other underestimating the power of a support network. Now you can accomplish great things by yourself, but imagine the heights you could reach with even just one or two like-minded individuals who not only hold you accountable, but actually work with you toward a common goal. 3. Don't underestimate the power of music. This might sound like an odd point to attribute to a race of dispassionate logicians, but the Dwemer were highly invested in the power of mathematics, and music is inherently mathematical by nature. Modern astrophysics tells us that math is the language of the universe, and it's only through that language, which was used to formulate theories of gravity, motion, and relativity, that we understand what little we do about the workings of the celestial. But the Dwemer showed us that music is a language spoken by the universe as well. It's pervasive, it's transcendent, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a person who wasn't moved in some way by some form of music. It resonates in our very souls, unlocking the floodgates of creativity and inspiration, almost as if we were uniquely attuned to receive it. Take advantage of that, and like the Dwemer, use music as a tool for changing your reality. 4. Dare to reach for the heavens. One of the most admirable qualities about the Dwemer was the way in which they deviated from the typical Marish perspective. They didn't see divinity as some distant, lofty goal to be placed on a pedestal. As far as they were concerned, the gods were made of the exact same stuff as they were. The only trick was figuring out how to arrange their particles in the correct order. In the story of Azura and the Box, when the clever old Nichilbar tricked Azura, he revealed that there were limits to the power of gods, and that mortals could create their own destinies. Only one of the onlookers managed to catch a glimpse of the goddess's expression before she was gone, and he was struck mute with terror. The old Dwemer too was pale and shaken, but his face shone not with fear, but with bliss, for he had dedicated his life to proving what was achievable. And finally, cultivate a proficiency for emotional detachment. The third sermon of the 36 Lessons of a Vec details the journey of a yet unborn Vec who found his way into the hands of the Dwemer. According to this sermon, he confounded his captors by channeling his essence into love, an emotion the Dwemer knew nothing about. He later implied that their failure to understand love would be their downfall, but then again, that's coming from a guy who used his divinity to rewrite his own history, in which he was an egg carried by a robot that eventually gave birth to itself. The point is, emotional attachment is a risky proposition because it can cause you to lose objectivity. Now, there's a time and a place for emotion, but learning how to detach yourself from it will serve you well when the decision comes, as many of them do, that requires the calm, collected reasoning of the head rather than the volatile, impulsive sentimentality of the heart. Regrettably, I think that many misunderstand the Deep Elves to have been a cold, calculating, and spiteful race, particularly in light of the interaction between them and the Falmer. But I want to leave you with a fascinating piece of text which I hope will present another side to the Dwemer, a side which portrays their actions not as the malevolent designs of vicious slave masters, but as a gift of warmth and benevolence from a misinterpreted people who wished only to afford their brothers the same opportunity they sought after themselves, to allow the Falmer to gain the benefit of centuries of intensive research and labor, and to help them find release from the mortal coils that bind, as all Mer so desperately wish to do. A translated excerpt from Calcelmo's Stone.
And so it was that your people were given passage to our steam gardens and the protection of our mathematics. Many of your people had perished under the roaring, snow-throated kings of Mora, and your wills were broken, and we heard you, and sent our machines against your enemies, to thereby take you under. Only by the grace of the Dwemer did your culture survive, and only by the 15 and 1 tones did your new lives begin. We do not desire thanks, for we do not believe in it. We do not ask for gratitude, for we do not believe in it. We only request you partake of the symbols of our bond, the fruit of the stones around us. And as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not. Know only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before, and sets your final path to the music of your new identity.
No, I wasn't eating croutons. Make sure you subscribe to join the order and ring that resounding bell of Muscle and Magicka so that all future quests show up directly in your quest log. And by the way, a huge thank you to Sir Johnny Cheesedog from the Discord, aka the Maestro of Memery, for lending his voice to the end of that video. And if you should like to bathe yourself in the dulcet tones of Johnny's beautiful voice, then you too can join the Discord and commune with Johnny and the rest of your fellow knights. And who knows? Maybe one day you even find your own voice featured in the Muscle and Magicka video. Joining the Discord may or may not actually result in your voice being featured in the Muscle and Magicka video. Most likely won't. Side effects for joining the Discord include coughing, sneezing, dry mouth, dizziness, bleeding out the anus, headache, and sometimes death. If you or a loved one has joined the Discord of Muscle and Magicka, you may be entitled to financial compensation. The Discord of Muscle and Magicka is linked to asbestos exposure. Exposure to asbestos in the Navy, shipyard, mills, heating, construction, or automotive industries may put you at risk. Please don't wait. Call 1-800-MUSCLE and Magicka today for a free legal consultation and financial information packet. What?